14. The Gate to Phyrexia. Jarsil has always been a transitional figure in most of the respected histories, born too late for the Brothers' War, born much too early for the most interesting parts of the Dark. Yet he has been a key piece of the puzzle. What is known by Modem Man about the legendary Dreadlands of Phyrexia, comes from Jarsil's personal notes, and though there are those who dismiss his legend as a folktale or moral fable, there are those who continue to seek out his truths and attempt to find Phyrexia for themselves. When they do not return, everyone assumes that they have finally found it. Arkal, Argivian scholar. The journal was the original, not a transcription or a later reprinting. Jodah placed his hand on the weathered cover. The black leather was cracked in places but still unpeeled and whole. The thin tome's corners were shot in gold, and, touching it, Jodah could feel something. Perhaps it was just the ghost of long-cast magic, or perhaps it was a spiritual connection between his ancestor and himself. He could almost feel Jarsil reaching out to him through time. Jodah held his breath when he first opened its cover and turned its thin pages. He was afraid, from its age and import, that the volume might fall into dust at the first touch. The book's pages were made of vellum, pounded and worked so thin as to become translucent, and the rich, multicolored inks had faded with the passage of time. He had handled older books than this in the library, and ones in worse shape, too, but this one held great power, not only because Mersal had entrusted it to him personally but more because of who supposedly wrote it. "Take it with you," the Lord High Mage said. "I want your opinions on the text." Over the next 10 days Jodah pored over the volume. He transcribed everything he could read in the text and then held each page in front of the light to see if there were any pen scratchings that had lost their ink. There were many. There were also various notes in the margin, some no more than scribbles. Jodah had to determine if they were written by the same writer but could only guess as to when the marginalia had been written. The journal was crammed with information, very little of it useful from a magical approach. It was written at the manner of that much Jodah was certain. The text was an odd mix of magical theory and local gossip, of daily affairs and deep thought. A note of the purchase of several geese was right next to a long column of numbers, their purpose unknown. A drawing of weights and balances, of the placement of mirrors and lenses, was interrupted by a remembrance of Jarsil's visit to his own grandmother's funeral pyre. There was a detailed proof, with no preamble, that continued for a page and a half and finished with the conclusion, "Of course it works." Written in a florid hand, but there was no indication of what it was he was trying to prove in the first place. There was nothing about colors and barely anything about the power of the land itself. Jarsil assumed much, Jodah realized, about how magic really worked. Perhaps he was following the artificers of the era, trying to define magic in terms of physical mechanics and not as it seemed to function in reality. The journal would not say either way. Mersal asked for daily reports. At first Jodah was nervous, unsure he could add anything that was not already obvious to the Lord High Mage. He made mention of what was written of Jarsil's grandmother, who originally founded the family line in Giva, but that was lacking. Even Jarsil referred to her only as Granomama, without clue as to her identity. She had been powerful once and might have been nobility from another nation that had fallen in the Brothers' War in exile, spending her life in a place that was not her home. Jodah's first draft of his initial report was flowery and fawning. Jodah read it, realized that Shannon or Lucan could have written it, and ripped it up. The report that Mersal received had something of what life was like in Giva, both from Jodah's own memory and the stories of his grandmother. The Lord High Mage sent a brief note back encouraging Jodah to continue working in that line. Jodah pressed on. He started pulling books from the library and asking Netta about how life was when she was young. The old woman indicated frostily that she was not that old, but did direct Jodah to some texts that were written over a century ago. Jodah discovered that there was much on rulers and battles and little on daily life and private matters. Still, he pieced together enough by the second day to know the size of the beast referred to when Jarsil spoke of a cross piece the size of an ox yoke. Jodah, knew which species his ancestor would have used to plow the fields, the larger, hardier breed that had long since gone feral in the mountains and now had longer hair, as opposed to its timid cousin, which had become weaker and more inbred with the passing centuries. From that he could calculate what the distance Jarsil mentioned truly was. By the 5th day, Jodah began to understand Jarsil's basic concepts. There were worlds beyond this one, he was saying. Imagine the world as a house without doors. If you were within such a house, you would never be able to discover what was outside. Indeed, the outside might be filled with water, or poisons, or fierce creatures. Let's say that you could make a door and discover that there was a house next door to yours, as big as yours, with other people living there. That was what Jarsil had done. He had found a way to open a door to another place, not another part of the same house but another house entirely. That house was called Phyrexia. Jodah sent a quick message to the Lord High Mage and went to bed. When he awoke later in the day there was an enthusiastic response and the question, "How do you open that door?" Jodah took to eating in his room or the library. He saw little of Shannon, but that was apparently to both their satisfaction. Jodah would prowl the library for various references and then look for references mentioned by those references. If he could not find them, Jodah would send a short note to the Lord High Mage, and the books would appear, as if by magic itself. Jodah became more sure of himself as well. His reports to Mersal were less tentative and more direct, and the responses were in turn encouraging while not effusive. Slowly he stopped thinking of the Lord High Mage as the most powerful spellcaster in the conclave, first among equals. Indeed, comparing Mersal's behavior to most of the rest of the conclave, he was the one adult among children, the only individual who seemed to think beyond practical jokes and gossip and dinner. When his brain was filled beyond capacity, Jodah would walk the parapets and walls of the citadel. During the day he would study the mountains themselves, in those periods when the clouds lifted and allowed a brief view of their majesty, marching row after row southward. In the evenings, the battlements were lit by magical flame that spewed from the stonework itself, the fires that Jodah had seen upon his arrival. Jodah watched the lights and by the 8th day found he could summon the fire in the way Fosca had. He understood why the battlement flames functioned and could now duplicate it. He placed that spell among the others, among the light spells and healing spells and power-removing spells he had put in his mind's manor. On the 9th day he unlocked the greater secret of what his ancestor was talking around, the greater spell that led him into this other universe, this other house. It was in many ways worse than Fosca's definition of describing a dance. Jodah felt as if he was studying the reactions of the audience and from that trying to deduce the movements of the dance. Now at last, Jodah though he knew the dance. On the 10th day he sent a brief message to the Lord High Mage saying he wished to try Jarsil's spell. An immediate reply, carried by Barl himself, scheduled the attempt for after the dinner hour. Jodah missed dinner that evening in his preparations and arrived at the door to Mersal's private study. Barl was not present this time, and the door was locked. Jodah tentatively touched the gold rune in the black door, and the bolt shot open. The heavy door swung open a crack from its own weight. "Come in," came the fluid voice from within. "I've set the wards to admit you." Jodah pushed the door the rest of the way back, and Mersal was seated on a low footstool, hovering over a collection of wheels and gears made of metal and stone. When he had been in the room the first time Jodah had not inspected it, being at first too intimidated by Mersal and then too surprised by Jarsil's tome. Now he realized that this must be the mystery project that Barl was having his artificers create. He thought of Shannon, laboring in the gardens, and hoped the unkempt artificer avoided any other accidents while recovering. Mersal looked up at the younger mage's arrival. The magical light from his desk lamps reflected off the shining glowing bits of his calendar of stone and metal, illuminating his face from beneath and giving him a weird unearthly appearance, like some goblin creature stretched into a human form. Mersal smiled, and in the unnatural reflection of the machine's light the smile looked more like a snarl. "Are you ready to try?" Jodah nodded. Mersel said, "Are you sure that this opens into the other world?" Jodah nodded again, and added, "What little he describes seems to be like no place on this world, rains of acid, rich jungles made of metal leaves, and machine creatures more complex than any of Urza's or Mishra's legendary clockworks. He calls it Phyrexia, though that word is not found in any other reference volume and may itself be the name provided by natives he encountered there. But he does not mention any natives," said Mersel, "other than the machines." "No," said Jodah, "though I found similarities between the great beasts he found there and the Makfua of Phylagi legend, but the connection may be coincidental. No mention of natives, but if there were no natives..." His voice trailed off. "Then where did the name come from?" Mersel finished the thought. Jodah started at the words, then nodded. Of course Mersel had read the book. Of course he had seen the few, faint references to Phyrexia, this supposed world next door. But, wondered Jodah, did Mersel's conclusions match his own? Jodah suddenly felt like a small child at the family religious ritual. Everyone else had seen and heard the ritual 100 times. Only Jodah, the child, was new to it, and nervous. He looked at Mersel, and the High Lord Mage was smiling, but Jodah could not figure out the reason why. "Are you ready to start, friend Jodah?" the taller mage said. Jodah set out the various components he knew he needed, from the descriptions given in Jarsil's tome. Some were scientific in nature, such as a set of 5 crystals set in a precise, evenly spaced pattern, or a glyph of a particular shape carved in a dark metal. Some of the components were mystical in nature, such as a goblin skin bag of powdered bone, or the runes marked on the slate floor in chalk. Some Jodah did not know what purpose they served, save that they were mentioned and might be important. On the sideboard he set out his recording scarab and 3 sheets of parchment, each overlapping the other at the bottom. He had discovered in the library that this way he did not have to change sheets as often, and he did not want to miss anything that was said during the casting. Mersel had by this time retreated to his stone calendar and lingered over it a long while as Jodah prepared. At last the Lord High Mage asked, "Are you ready?" Jodah bit his lip and nodded. "Then begin," said Mersel, his hands snaking out and inverting a small hourglass. Jodah closed his eyes, opened his mind, and imagined farmland, the area around Jarsil's ruined tower. It had been abandoned after the wizard's disappearance and emptied of its contents by his apprentice and servants. That had to have been when the book Mersel had given to Jodah was taken. The tower itself was used as a quarters for workers picking cranberries, then just for storage of farm implements. Then, about a century ago, a savage windstorm caved in the sides, and all but the great foundation stones were used to build walls between the fields. Jodah had climbed over the great foundation stones as a boy. They were wide and flat and inscribed with rain-carved tunnels that he always thought of as forgotten runes. Jodah stood on those stones and imagined himself the hero that repelled all attackers and broke all sieges. He thought he felt the power within that land even then. The air felt somehow thicker there than elsewhere on the manor, and now the mana he pulled from it seemed heavier and more viscous than the energy from other memories. He wondered, briefly, if it was the result of his own youthful attachment to the place. He pulled that mana and slowly began to work the spell. It was a rough spell, worked completely from the hints within his ancestor's journal. First one crystal made a high-pitched, whining sound, then a second, a half-tone off, then a third, and then the final 2, all vibrating to their natural frequencies. Jodah touched the glyph-covered plate, and it already felt warm. Jodah cast a healthy sprinkling of the bone out in the air and the crystals changed their pitch. Jodah smiled and cast another sprinkling. Again the crystals changed their pitch, vibrating at a still higher frequency. The glyph plate now glowed of its own heat. The mana in Jodah's mind was an intense, white ball now, and he opened that part of his brain to the spell, letting the radiance flow into the framework of the spell he had created. And nothing happened. The whiteness at the base of Jodah's brain refused to move, refused to pass through the mental conduit into the predetermined part of the ritual. At first Jodah thought that he had not pulled sufficient mana from the land, and in a panic-stricken moment he brought forth more memories of the gardens and wheat fields, and the ball in the base of his brain grew hotter still as it accreted the mana. And the whiteness did not move from his mind. Jodah could feel the sweat running down his temples now. He opened his eyes, but his vision was blurry and the room indistinct. He could hear Mersel say something, but the part of his brain that listened would not or could not decipher the words. The hot white ball at the base of his brain began to burn, scorching its way through his flesh. Jodah tried to force the mana into the framework of the spell, but it would not go. Jodah felt the hairs in his nostrils begin to catch fire, and they smelled of ammonia. He thought of Shannon's story of the fallen. With a cry, Jodah reached upward and cast loose the mana. He quickly pulled another spell from his memory and threw the burning ball of memories into that. Hot, white fireworks shot from each of the young man's outstretched hands, and Jodah thought he screamed. Then he blacked out from the pain. He awoke to Mersel's calm, dispassionate face, framed by stars. No, not entirely dispassionate, but rather curious, as if Jodah was a frog laid out for dissection. What he had thought were the stars were instead glowing white embers that were now embedded in the ceiling of Mersel's private study. "What happened, Jodah?" said Mersel. There was no friend here, but rather the terse demanding tone of a disappointed patron. "I don't know," said Jodah. "El summoned the mana successfully, but I failed to move it into the framework of the spell." Mersel's brows deeply furrowed as Jodah spoke. The physical matrix refused the mystic force. He rose and walked around the desk, each step getting tenser and angrier. "We had the matrix, but the force refused it?" "Damn it to the hells," shouted Mersel suddenly, and with one sweep cleared the desks of books. Heavy volumes, scrolls, and the journal itself cascaded to the floor with a thundering smash. Mersel did not wait for the volumes to hit but slammed the desktop with a fist. Jodah was surprised the Lord High Mage did not break either the desk or his hand. "We were so damned close." He looked up at Jodah, and there was fire in his eyes. He started to snarl, "You must have." Then he stopped and took a deep breath. Then a second, letting it out like a low whistle. Then he said, in a calm, measured voice, "Are you all right, friend Jodah?" Jodah said he was, and added, "I'm sorry about your ceiling." "Seal?" Mersel looked up at the thousands of small pinpricks of light now driven into the ceiling above him. The Lord High Mage gave a tired chuckle. "Think nothing of it," he said, and with a wave of his hand, each and every one of the lights went out. "What?" Jodah took a deep breath, then started again, "Friend Mersel, what do we do now?" "Do," said Mersel, and for a moment it looked as if he would lose his temper again. Instead, he just shook his head wearily. "We do what every educated and proper mage would do. We review the facts and look for where we went wrong." "Are you sure everything else was correct?" Jodah looked at the remains of the spell materials on the room, and nodded. "I think so," he said. "But are you sure?" pressed Mersel. "It felt right," said Jodah, which was not the question Mersel asked. Mersel nodded and tugged at the corners of his mustache. "Then that's good enough." He snagged Jarsil's journal, which had sprawled, pages open, on the floor, and closed it thoughtfully, then handed the book to Jodah. "Here. Review it again. Surely there must be something both of us missed." No, don't worry about the equipment, I'll get a servant to take care of it." "You've been very effective, Jodah. When you have something, send me a message." With that Mersel ushered Jodah out of his study. The younger magician paused only briefly at the door, but the Lord High Mage was already making a beeline for his stonework creation in the corner of the room. Mersel stood in front of the calendar and tugged at the ruby in his ring. Jodah crept out of the room like a beaten dog. Maetzel had been horribly disappointed, and he hid it badly. Jodah was disappointed as well, but for different reasons. The past few days had been everything he had hoped being a true mage would entail, and it led up to this one moment. He had failed. Failed utterly and spectacularly, and now Maetzel probably did not trust him anymore. Jodah sighed, closed the black door behind him and padded down the hallway to the small wooden door that led to his own quarters.